All right, before the break, we were talking about the continuum of services and the different instructional venues that are used for students who have been labeled with a disability. The most recent controversy, really, in special ed has to do with whether or not students will be fully included in the regular ed classroom, or whether or not they will receive possibly some or maybe even in some cases all of their services, educational services, in much more restrictive venues. This controversy really emanated from the work of a woman named Wills, W-I-L-L-S, who was in Washington, D.C. in the Department of Education. And she had a son who was severely retarded, and she really fueled the fire for the full inclusion movement, or the notion that people with disabilities are fully entitled to participate in all aspects of the educational program, and that is a civil right that they are entitled to as citizens of our country. And she argued, as do other full proponents of inclusion, that the continuum of services really cannot satisfy the needs for students with disabilities. And these proponents of full inclusion really propose that regardless of the severity or the nature or the degree of an individual's disability, they should receive their educational services in the general ed classroom for the entire school day. And there are certainly a wide group of people who maintain this position. On the other hand, there are a number of people who take a much broader view of inclusion and think that that maybe full inclusion is not the best way. But for those of people who do advocate full inclusion for every single person with disabilities, they maintain that full inclusion is, first of all, a civil right. It's an entitlement for all people in our society, regardless of whether or not they have a disability. And they see full inclusion for people with disabilities in the same way that they perceive full inclusion for people with a variety of ethnic and religious persuasions, is that we include and make open and available all services to all people. They particularly note that full inclusion reduces the stigma that is associated with having a learning disability and receiving a disability label. I don't know if any of you had the experience, or some of you may or may not, of having been diagnosed with a disability and receiving services in pull-out programs when you were in school. If you didn't, certainly you probably knew of someone who had a disability and maybe went to special education. I can remember when my own children became aware of the fact that there was special ed and a resource room and that some kids had to go there. And they were concerned that they might have to go there, and they perceived this as threatening to them. They didn't want to do this. And so it made me aware of how difficult it is for a child to be labeled with a disability and have that label be their only access to an individualized, appropriate education. I can tell you, based on experience, that most people who are entitled to a special education based on a disability label are not interested in having it under those circumstances. And I can tell you that as a faculty member years ago, in this class, I used to teach this class with Dr. Lieberman. Some of you have probably had Dr. Lieberman already. Do you know Dr. Lieberman? Well, we used to teach this class, and we really did keep those students hopping around in the kiva. But anyway, when we came, actually, we didn't teach this class together. What we taught was Ed Psych together, but I taught the disability component, and he taught the rest of it. But when we came to the section on disabilities, we would ask students, what do you think about, mainstreaming, and do you think it's justified? And that's a question that we'll explore in greater detail at a later time. But what we discovered, of course, is that when people have to pay for individualized instruction by wearing a disability label or being identified, that end doesn't necessarily justify the means for them. People like disability labels a whole lot better if they're not the ones that have to wear them, if you will. So we're very sensitive to the fact of developing egos and the self-concept that grows along with other aspects of development, and that it's difficult for children to be stigmatized as having a learning disability or some other adjective assigned to them that is not perceived to be positive by them or anybody else. So one of the things that proponents of full inclusion maintain is if that we teach everybody in a mainstream environment or in a general ed classroom, we don't have to stigmatize kids by assigning labels to them. Full inclusion is in some respects more efficient. When we pull kids out of programs, we lose a lot of time, we lose a lot of resources. It's an expensive model, and the day becomes very fragmented for these children. They're right in the middle of something, and oops, it's time for them to go to resource. So this is a concern, as well as the notion that full inclusion really purports to everybody that we're all equal and have fair and equitable treatment. But in spite of the fact that there are proponents to full inclusion, we know that there are lots of barriers that exist that prevent us from fully including children with disabilities in mainstream settings. And one of those is the lack of preparation for general ed teachers. And certainly one of the things we seek to do in courses such as this is prepare you with additional skills and help you with strategies that will make you more effective at encountering and meeting the needs of diverse learners in your classroom, so that when you have a child who can't keep up, you have some idea about what to do about it. And if you can't figure it out on your own, you know where to go to get help, so that you're not frustrated and really exacerbating the problem for this child. In addition to lack of teacher preparation, we also have a lack of resources to support full inclusion. We don't have enough co-teachers. We don't have enough special education personnel to come in and deliver special education related services in general ed classrooms. And often teachers fear that if they're in a full inclusion model, they'll get these children and then they won't get the help and the resources and the support they need to make education effective for these learners. In addition to resources, there's an issue of time. Teachers are always concerned that they don't have enough time to meet the needs of the general ed kids in their classroom, much less general ed kids and special ed kids too. So teachers, as well as others, perceive that there are a number of barriers to general ed classrooms, and that these barriers really make, at this point in time, full inclusion for all children with all disabilities not a particularly realistic idea. And now I think what we have is some parents who want their own child fully included, but may not believe in, because of the nature of the child's disability, want their child fully included, but they don't necessarily think every child ought to be fully included under all circumstances. And one of the things you see is that if you take two children who have Down syndrome, for example, one parent may be very committed to fully including that child in a general ed classroom, in a general ed program, and want their child fully included, and that may be a very effective strategy for that child. Another parent with a child with a similar disability may have a different notion. So the appropriate continuum of services isn't necessarily a 100% match of the service delivery model and the disability label. Sometimes what makes a special education placement appropriate for a child is the perception of the parent and the individual characteristics of a child, which may or may not reflect the level of disability that he has. And children with Down syndrome have just as different personalities as you have from the girl sitting next to you. They're not all the same, and one child may be more adventurous and more determined. You see this especially in 7th grade kids, middle school kids. How many of you are middle school teachers? Who's going to be a middle school teacher? Just my one. Now, I know I'm not going to call on you. You can feel free to hold up your hand. You're just one middle school? Well, there are always several in here, so there'll no doubt be some in the distance ed section. But what you'll discover with your middle school kids in special ed is that they either see special ed in one of two ways. They'd do anything in the world to get out of special ed, or they have found that to be a comfortable environment in which they can succeed, and they won't leave. If you try to encourage them to be more mainstream, by the time they're in the 6th or 7th grade, they may not be willing to entertain a different placement option. So that doesn't necessarily have to do with their academic skill level or their disability label or anything else. It may be their individual personalities and the experiences they had earlier in life in a general ed classroom. So there are a lot of things that are very individual that may make one placement suitable for one child and his family, and another placement suitable and appropriate and desirable for another child, even though on paper these two children appear to be very much the same. So for this reason as well as others, there are many people who are proponents still of a continuum of services. And they really believe that the service continuum presented in Dino's Cascade ought to be available for all students to choose from, and that this continuum of services allows us to more appropriately match services available in the schools with the needs of children and their families. And they use as support for their position the fact that that really a continuum of services is necessary to maintain the integrity of a service delivery model, that there will never be any model of education that is appropriate for all children under all circumstances. And I sort of think that's true about everything in education. Anytime you have a teaching technique, a strategy, a method, a material that's supposed to solve all the problems for all the people in all the world, it's likely not to do so. So I'm pretty much in that vein of thinking myself, is that for us to increase our effectiveness, we need to offer people lots and lots of options. And as that options have increased over the course of my lifetime, options for women, options for students, options for children in school, I think that the bureaucracy does a better job of meeting individual needs than when we become more restrictive in what we perceive as appropriate. Proponents of a continuum of services also maintain that sometimes the regular classroom setting can be stigmatizing, that children go to school in classrooms where children are allowed to make fun of others with a disability, or to belittle them or make them feel inadequate, inferior in some way. We'll talk more about that in the course of the semester. I pretty much have a zero tolerance for allowing children to say uncharitable things for one another. I don't think that's a natural developmental milestone that children go through, and I think when you're allowing children to say uncharitable things to one another, you're really you're sanctioning child abuse, is my opinion. But we'll talk more about that as the semester goes on. Proponents of a continuum of services also maintain that oftentimes general ed teachers are not prepared for full inclusion. They don't have the resources that are necessary to make this a reality. And they point out most of all, and I think in the most important vein, is that research evidence so far does not indicate that a full inclusion is really superior in many ways to other educational venues for teaching some kids with disabilities. Now, The authors of this book that we're using this semester have also conducted a considerable amount of research on inclusion, and they have discovered that most teachers do in fact support the idea of including some children with disabilities in their general ed classroom, but don't necessarily agree that the general ed classroom is the best place for all students with disabilities. They also have discovered what you probably already know, and that is that teachers really need a time and training and resources to be effective at meeting the needs of a variety of learners in their classrooms. And so it is with this interest in mind that we are making greater efforts in teacher education today to prepare teachers for the diverse academic performance of learners they are likely to encounter. When you look at the proportion of students you're likely to receive in your classroom, you will find that about 90% of all students with speech and language disabilities are in fact educated in a general ed classroom, as are a number like 80% of those with learning disabilities. About 3/4 of the students with other health impairments receive their education in a general ed classroom. A high proportion of children with visual impairments receive their education in a general ed classroom. Oftentimes, children with visual disabilities are housed in separate classrooms until they master mobility and also some form of reading and writing. They may need a braille or large print or whatever, and as soon as they manage to a response menu, a verbal response menu in braille or large print or typing or telecommunication, whatever they use, and as long as they're mobile, then they are usually mainstreamed right into general ed classrooms and are fairly easy to integrate, much easier in fact than our youngsters who are deaf or have a significant degree of hearing loss. In any event, you can see as you get down into orthopedic impairments and hearing impairments, fewer and fewer students are mainstreamed in general ed classrooms. And then as we get down into multiple disabilities and autism and deafblindness and some of these very severe disabilities, though I wouldn't put autism in the category of a severe disability. It's on a real wide range. We'll talk more about that later, but some autism spectrum disorder kids are very high functioning. But certainly deafblindness is a profound disability, and kids who are deafblind usually receive a majority of their education in a self-contained classroom. They may participate in recreational activities and lunch activities and be integrated with your class for small and social periods of the school day, but maybe not for so much for academic portions. But you see that sort of distribution where kids' placement is concerned. But you can see from that transparency too that you're likely to encounter a significant number of children with a disability label if you teach over any period of time. Now, your book talks about some strategies for teaching in inclusive settings, and I don't dwell too much on these strategies at the end of the book. The authors of this book are real big on acronyms, and I think that I can do without most of them. I think they're sort of superficial, and I don't think you have many, if any, test items over these acronyms, so I'd much rather you learn other things than memorize acronyms that you're going to forget in 15 minutes. But certainly we know in order to teach anybody effectively, we need to identify our objectives and determine what they are and in what order they ought to be taught, and have appropriate instructional materials available, and so on and so forth. So your book goes into these things and in some detail, and certainly they're worth looking over and thinking about. But I had rather spend some time for the remainder of today, talking about the lesson plan format that we use in Quest 1, which will also be used in this particular class. How many of you have taken Quest 1 classes before? How many of you have taken the Quest 1 class that has to do, the technology class for setting up your portfolio? Good. You will find that for those of you who haven't taken that class yet, you'll find that when you enroll in the technology class, what we will do is give you electronic guidelines for setting up a portfolio based on the competencies that it takes to be an effective teacher in Texas. And some of your assignments for 3360 will fit very well within your portfolio. But we're, as the instructors in Quest 1, which 3360 is a Quest 1 class, we have agreed to use the same lesson plan format, and it's sort of a modified version of the Madeline Hunter format, if you know that. How many of you have ever written a lesson plan before? Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. Well, you're going to get another chance this semester, and when you do respond to assignments or our independent practice that is in the form of an assignment for this class, if it requires a lesson, you will use this lesson plan format. As I structured my own lessons for this class, or the direct instruction part, the face-to-face that you see here or on tape, I have also tried to structure my lessons according to this particular lesson cycle or lesson plan format. And of course, our title each time for our lesson is dictated by the book title. So I don't have, the chapter title for each chapter. We will go for the 12 chapters, first 12 chapters in your book. So our lesson is always driven by what the chapter title is. On the WebCT, you will find in the syllabus, embedded in the syllabus, and some of the links in there, the PowerPoint presentation that serves as the basis for each of my lectures. And on the student copy of those PowerPoints, you will see the lesson objectives. The lesson objectives determine what I would like for you to derive from each particular presentation that I give. So I want you to know in advance. You can print your PowerPoints in advance. You can use them to guide the notes that you take during class or during the video observation for those on distance ed, and you can see beforehand what I want you to get out of that, and you can take notes on that. But our lesson objectives really derive directly from what I want you to learn about this section of the book, this particular chapter we're on. Now, we will also start each lesson with a sort of a focus question as Madeline Hunter, and this might be a motivation for your kids. You might walk into a dark room and ask them how you think that we get lights turned on or whatever. You can have any sort of focus or motivational set you want for your kids, but I start with sort of a focus question that I hope makes you think about what's going on. Then I do my presentation, and usually the materials that you need are available for you on the WebCT Vista. And then we will do a guided practice. And this semester, Kim will be providing our guided practices for you. But during the guided practice of our lesson, we'll go over really a direct application of the things that we've been talking about. So in a few minutes, I will turn the floor over to Kim, and she will go through a guided practice for you. Then if you decide that this is an assignment that you would like to complete for 3360, you will complete the independent practice, which is on your WebCT in the form of an assignment 1. So our guided practices for each of our lectures we'll do in class. The independent practice will appear in the form of an assignment on the WebCT. Now, one of the things you need to know, it is in your syllabus as well, but the assignment link will be hot when you get out of class today. But you only have 2 weeks to complete this assignment. Then that assignment link will die. But each week there will be a hot link that will last for 2 weeks. But if you choose to do the assignment over today's lecture, you have to have it submitted within 2 weeks. Because after that time, that link dies. And don't write Kim telling her, oh, I was 5 minutes late, my computer did it, I've done the whole thing, please let me submit it late, because she's on strict orders from me to tell you no. You have to get your assignment submitted. So allow yourself 6 hours there for your computer to misfire and have to go to your girlfriend or boyfriend's house and download it, or come up to here to the site lab and submit it. When that link dies, that's the end of it. And all of this is electronic, so it isn't just as easy as me saying, oh yeah, we'll go ahead and submit it, because you really can't submit it when the link expires. We can't track the volume of papers that would be required, for that, and so on and so forth. So I want you to know that in advance, that that's how it will be. In any event, your independent practice in here will be an assignment. But for your class, independent, I'll talk about that in a minute. In the end, in this class, our assessments, of course, will be our 2 tests. But if you were using this lesson cycle to do an assignment or teach a class, you would, of course, have the objectives for yourself. What would that be in the classroom? What determines your objectives? If you're going to be a 3rd grade teacher, how do you know what you're supposed to teach? The TEKS. Well, I'm afraid the TOS, but let's say not. Let's say the TEKS. The curriculum guide for our state is called the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for a particular grade level. Those are available for you on the internet. You ought to look them up for the grade level you intend to teach, just on general principles, for no other reason. But they're easy to find. They're everywhere. I'm sure you could Google them for that matter. But in any event, your lesson objective will be driven by some extent by the TEKS that are appropriate for the subject matter you're teaching and the grade level that you want to teach. For each of your lessons, you ought to develop an anticipatory set, something that makes these kids want to know more about what you have to tell them. What would make them interested in this? What would make them even want to do this lesson? Can you remember going home when you were in high school and saying, why is she making me teach this stuff, learn this stuff? I had a child, one of my children came home and had to take algebra. I think he had to take it about 4 or 5 times, but he finally graduated from high school, so it ended well. But he came home as sophomore in high school and said, why do they make me take this stupid stuff? I hate it. And I couldn't really think of one reason why he had to take algebra, so I wasn't very well equipped to answer his question, but maybe that's because I wasn't a math teacher. Are you going to be a math teacher? No, that's all right. You probably don't know why he had to take algebra anyway then, but if you're writing a lesson, you ought to have some way of communicating to your children that this is important and it's something you want to know and it's going to be fun for you to learn. And that's your anticipatory set or your motivational hook. Then you will have your lesson description, your presentation, what you're going to do, what is involved in your presentation, what materials are necessary. And then you need a guided practice. You need some venue for determining whether these children you've been talking to for the last 30 minutes have learned what you said, right? And if they did, what happens?
Have them do something on their own.
Then they do an independent practice. And if they haven't, what happens? Then we need to do a vertical expansion of our lessons. We need to make some provisions, vertical provisions, for the kids who learned what they were supposed to learn so they're not doing it again. This could be enrichment of any form. These could be kids who are, you're doing spelling and you give the pretest. They know it. Send them to the computer and let them translate these words into a foreign language, or write a story, a creative story using these words, or give them some choices. Choose one of these 5 things. Look up the origin of these words. Whatever you think might appeal to a group of children who already know how to spell these words, because writing them 5 times is not going to get it, right? There isn't any reason for them to write it 5 times. They already know it. On the other hand, for these children who flunked the pretest, we can be certain that what's going to happen tomorrow on the post-test. They're going to flunk it then too if we don't do something between now and then. So what we want to do is provide additional learning experiences for these children who are low achievers, who are likely to be our children who are either struggling or identified as having a disability. We want to reteach these children, or have them peer tutored, or team them up with somebody else, or have them trace these letters in sandpaper. But we want to give them additional opportunities to learn the lesson, so when we get to the spelling test on Friday, they're going to pass that spelling test. So this is a lesson cycle we'll be using in here. It takes into account that all children aren't learning in the same way, at the same time, at the same pace, right? And that we need to modify our lessons to accommodate the range of learners that we have in our classrooms, because everybody is not going to get it. They're not going to have the same light bulb moment. We need to acknowledge that and build in strategies for working on that in our lesson plans. And so that's sort of the lesson cycle we'll use in here, and a rationale for why. The bottom line on this is that I find many, many really, really good teachers have a model of instruction that allows them to present their lesson and administer a test and move on, regardless of how many children have not learned it. And no matter how wonderful you are as a teacher, and how creative your lessons are, and how effective you are in delivering them, if you make your presentation, do all these fun learning things, assess the kids, and ignore the fact that a large percent of them didn't get it, you're not going to be the best teacher you can be, no matter how fabulous your lessons are. They're not so fabulous that everybody is going to march in step and sing on key. That's the nature of the beast. And you ask me, do I do that in my teaching? Absolutely I do. Nothing would please me any more than for everybody enrolled in 3360 this time to earn an A. It would tickle me pink. I would think I was the best teacher in the entire world. You cannot be a good teacher when you're failing your students. I tell you what I want you to know. I tell you, I give you the book. I do everything. And there is never an effort in a class I've ever taught to force a distribution of scores. I wish you would ever, learn everything you were supposed to learn. And I try to provide it for you so you can get it. But read it, hear it, listen to it, get it from your sister, or your best friend. Just please don't copy her assignments. But I want you to be that same kind of teacher, so that you're giving kids in your classroom multiple venues and multiple opportunities and multiple learning experiences. And no matter how wonderful your lessons are, if you just go straight from teaching to assessment with no consideration to who might have missed the boat, you're not being the best teacher you can be. So that's the lesson plan format we will use. Right now, what I'm going to do is turn the floor over to Kim, who will be helping with the guided practice for Inherent, and we'll talk about some practical applications for the materials in Chapter 1. Whew. That was a mouthful.
Am I on? Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Kim Shoger, and I am the assignment lady. I will be doing the guided practices. I will be putting the assignments on the WebCT Vista for you to look at and consider doing. As Dr. Goodman said, you have to do 4 out of the 12 assignments following the 12 chapters in the book that she will be covering. For my guided practice today, I wanted to set the stage for the rest of the semester. I have a lot of experience with teaching special education, and I realize that all of you will be teaching in different settings. Some of you may be in fully inclusive schools, where every child who is considered special education is included in the regular classroom. As Dr. Goodman reviewed the continuum of services, other schools will have that continuum of services. Some students will be pulled out, some students will be in your classroom for part of the day. So I want to make sure, I want to set the stage for your experiences for the rest of the semester when you're learning about special education and inclusive settings. I am an enthusiastic supporter of inclusive schools. I've taught for many, many years in schools that have both the continuum of services and fully inclusive settings. So what I say may come from experience and also from the text and from what Dr. Goodman covers. I want to emphasize, before we do our little interactive experience here, that inclusion is not a place. A lot of times you'll hear a teacher say, oh, he's in inclusion. Well, it's not a classroom, it's not a room, it's not a portable outside of the school, it's not a place. It is a set of beliefs, it's an attitude that a school has about how they serve their special education students. One of the first steps in transforming the attitudes that people, teachers, the community, parents have about inclusion is realizing a few things. And we're going to do a little, 3 little things you're going to do for me. If you get a piece of paper and a pen out. One of the things I think we need to do when we talk to teachers and parents is to change their attitudes or confirm their attitudes about inclusive education. In 30 seconds, and I'm going to time you here, I want you to write down 5 words that define you. Who are you? List them 5 things that define you. Who are you? Not as easy as it sounds, is it? I see a few people struggling. Okay, that's about 30 seconds. Is anyone going to venture out and use their microphone on their table to tell me? Would anyone like to share what 5 things you wrote? 5 words that define you? Nobody's, oh, thank you.
A virtuous woman, a Christian, ambitious, loving, a singer.
Beautiful. Anyone else like to contribute? Oh, no more brave souls. My personal list was a mother, a wife, a student, a teacher, and a runner. You may have put that you are a daughter, a son, a mother, a wife. You may have put that you're a father, a couch potato, a marathon runner. Okay? Who in here wears glasses or contacts? Did any of you all put nearsighted, farsighted, myopic? Probably not. Of those ladies that said they were 5'3" or shorter, did you put short-statured? Height challenged? No. Let's see. I'm a little bit of a procrastinator, but that wasn't on my list either. Any procrastinators in here? Wait till the last minute. Was that on your list? No. So none of you defined yourself by a shortcoming. Is that true? None of you defined yourself by a behavior that may cause you problems sometime, like being a procrastinator. None of you defined yourself by a physical aberration, I hate to call it an aberration, or a physical characteristic. True? Okay. Well, people with disabilities don't want to be defined by that either. They don't want to be the learning disabled boy in my class. They don't want to be the autistic kid down the hall. They don't want to be the wheelchair-bound adult who works in my building. People with disabilities don't want to be defined by physical aberrations. They don't want to be defined by educational shortcomings. I did not put math challenged on my list, although, like Dr. Goodman's son, algebra was a real test for me in high school. So when we think of people with disabilities, don't think of their disability first. Think of the person first, because on their list, they will not put their disability as something that defines them. That's where our people first, person first language comes in that Dr. Goodman talked about. For example, we don't call, in our writing and our speaking as teachers, we don't say that handicapped child. We say that child with disabilities. We don't say the autistic boy that you have in class. We say the young man that has autism. Okay? So in your writing and in your speaking, be aware of that person first language. Put the person first, not the label. For your next little interactive lesson, another list, another 30 seconds, I'd like you to write down 5 supports that you use daily to help you get you through your day.
Like people?
Could be. Anything that you use as a support to help you get through your busy, busy day. And I'm going to be asking for another brave soul to share, so. Okay, our 30 seconds is up. Would anyone like to share their list of supports they use to help them through their day, either at work or school, in everyday life? Yes, ma'am.
Mine is my parents, my boyfriend, my friends, my pets, and me time.
I like the me time part, something we don't always get. Very good. Her list happened to include support, people who support her during the day. Was anyone's list a little bit different from that? Yes, ma'am. Move the microphone over there for you.
Mine was vitamins, radio, prayer, to get enough rest, and eating well.
Very good. Well thought out. Anyone else? Oh, we're getting braver and braver. Anyone have a PDA on their list?
Organizing.
There you go. Little organized, the Palm Pilots, they call them Palm Pilots. I have one of those. Oh, my husband gets after me about that one. How about your eyeglasses? Can you make it through the day without your eyeglasses or your contacts? How about your telephone? Your computer? Your reminder lists? Oh boy, I have sticky notes all over my computer at home. I hope no one else does. A calculator. How many of you balanced your checkbook this week and had to use a calculator to make it a little easier? Do we use all of those things because we have disabilities or problems? No. No, the math disability comes in there. That, oh boy. We use those things because we need them to make our job, our everyday living, the things we need to accomplish in a busy day, we use those things to make it easier for us. We use those things because we need to get a task done, and using that will help us. It will facilitate us in getting those tasks done. Well, people with disabilities, we have to think about what they need to help them through their day, to help them succeed in your classroom. So instead of saying, Johnny, well, he's got behavior problems. Well, no, he needs behavior support in your classroom. He needs supports in place to be successful in your classroom. When we think about things that students need instead of, oh boy, does that kid have problems? Well, no, he needs certain things to make it through the day in your classroom that you can provide as the classroom teacher. People with disabilities don't need fixed. Their problems don't need fixed. They need tools to help them be successful. So keep that in mind as a regular classroom teacher, a general ed classroom teacher, when you have students with disabilities in your classroom. Ready for our yes, ma'am?
I was just, I was just going to tell you, I sub, and I was in a fully inclusive classroom, and there's a little boy with behavioral problems, and the teacher has like a strip of Velcro on his desk, and he has like little notes, and he like where he's supposed to be when he's supposed to be at his desk, there's a picture of a desk that she sticks on there, and when he goes to the bathroom, and it's all day what his schedule is, she puts it on his desk so that he can...
A visual schedule.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
very helpful for many children, especially children with autism, and during your assignments for the semester, you'll be able to use some of those ideas that you've come across and put those in your assignments. When I taught children who, see, you got brownie points now. When I taught a child who had, who was deaf, I used to have to wear the little microphone, and he went straight to his hearing aids. Well, if you ever have that in your classroom, don't forget to turn off the little microphone when you leave the class to use the restroom or the telephone. That's just a, a little hint, because I was talking to my husband on the telephone. I came back in, and he just thought that was hysterical. And I finally realized, luckily, I didn't say anything that was too telling to my husband. Part 3, one more list for us today. I'd like you to write down the 5 traits or characteristics of a good teacher. The 5 traits or characteristics that you consider make a good teacher. Okay, I'm going to ask one more time for someone to share with us. Boy, this could be a lot of things. Anyone? Anyone willing to share? Yes, ma'am. You're next.
Patient, understanding, organized, love his or her job, and willing to put forth the time and the effort.
Absolutely. Very good list. Would you like to? Okay.
I put creative, caring, understanding, intelligent, and I put innovative. I don't, kind of like, coming up with ideas, but I guess that kind of goes with creative. But.
Absolutely. Anyone put supportive, reflective, flexible? That's, a lot of people had that one, okay. Caring, fair, knowledgeable, the ones that we heard in that list, all of these things make a good teacher. All of those things are traits of a competent, effective teacher. All of those things will make you, if you have those qualities, a good teacher. Well, guess what? All of those things that make you a good teacher in the general education classroom will make you a good teacher for children with disabilities. Good teaching is good teaching, and Dr. Goodman said this in her lecture today. What we teach all students will work with children with disabilities. Children with disabilities want to be valued. They want to learn the same things everybody else is learning. So all of those traits you listed, what makes a good teacher, make those traits part of you and use them when you're teaching children with disabilities, because what's good teaching for some is good teaching for all. 2 points I'd like to make to end with. Like I said, I was trying to kind of set the stage today for your assignments, for this assignment that's on the web CT Vista now, and for the assignments that we'll have all through the semester. Keep these things in mind when you're doing your writing, when you're reading your book, your text, and when you go out to become teachers. Keep these things in mind. Expect competency, presume competence for all students. And there's one thing I'd like to read for you before I end today. It's Senator Robert Stafford, who was Dr. Goodman talked about the IDEA, and he was a strong proponent for IDEA when it was being considered. And he wrote, "This is not only an act of law for equality in education, but an act of love for those extraordinary children wishing to live only ordinary lives." So I hope that you will keep that in your mind, in your hearts, when you go out to teach children with disabilities. And thank you for your wonderful thoughts. Thank you for sharing. Those of you who shared, I'm sure it will become more and more as the weeks go by. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. That give them lots of reinforcement for sharing. That's it.